Picture a quiet young woman born into humble beginnings, orphaned since childhood, living among an exiled people, surrounded by customs and traditions that were not her own, in a distant and often hostile land. Now imagine this same young woman being elevated to a position of honor and authority, becoming a courageous queen, called by God to fulfill a grand purpose, to save her nation from extinction. This is the journey we will explore today. Esther's path unfolds during a turbulent time, the exile of the Jewish people under the vast Persian Empire. It was a season marked by crises, political instability, and the ongoing challenge of maintaining spiritual identity in a world that neither understood nor accepted their beliefs. Far from Jerusalem and the temple, scattered across Persian provinces, the Jews fought to preserve their faith in the midst of a society that didn't share their values. It is within this intense and complex setting that the story unfolds, proving one powerful truth. God's presence and action are not confined to a geographic location. Even outside the Promised Land, God acts with purpose, showing that His care knows no borders. Esther, also known by her Hebrew name Hadassah, lived in the city of Susa, one of the empire's capitals. Still very young, she lost her parents and was raised by her cousin Mordecai, who took her in and became like a father to her. Mordecai plays a vital role in this narrative, not only protecting and guiding Esther, but also standing as a wise, upright man deeply rooted in the teachings of the Jewish faith. In a culture that rejected their values, Mordecai taught Esther to trust in the God of Israel, even in the darkest times. Thus, despite growing up an orphan in a foreign land, Esther was shaped by a strong foundation of faith, courage, and wisdom. This foundation would become essential when destiny placed her somewhere she never imagined, in the royal palace of the most powerful king of her time. It all begins with a lavish celebration hosted by King Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus, a luxurious event that lasted 6 months, followed by 7 more days of feasting at the royal palace. The biblical account paints a vivid picture of the event's splendor: fine linen tapestries, marble columns, gold and silver furnishings, all flowing with abundant wine. During the height of the celebration, the king commands his wife, Queen Vashti, to appear before the guests wearing her royal crown, so he could showcase her beauty. Vashti, however, refuses. This act of defiance, unheard of in that era, infuriates the king and alarms his advisors, who fear that her example could inspire other women to rebel against their husbands. To prevent this, they advise the king to remove her from her position. With Vashti deposed, the opportunity arises to seek a new queen. A decree is issued across the empire, summoning the most beautiful young women to the palace for a lengthy selection and preparation process. Esther was among the chosen. Despite her modest background and lack of noble lineage, she quickly caught the eye of Haggai, the official in charge of the harem. He treated her with special favor, providing the best care, beauty treatments, and guidance. According to Scripture, this wasn't by chance. It was the invisible hand of God paving the way. Mordecai instructed Esther to keep her Jewish identity a secret to protect her from potential danger. For an entire year, Esther underwent the royal beauty treatments required by the palace, baths with special oils, perfumes, and attention to her appearance. When the time came for her to appear before the king, her natural beauty, wisdom, and grace set her apart. Xerxes was instantly captivated by her. The Bible tells us the king loved Esther more than all the other women and placed the royal crown on her head, making her queen in Vashti's place, Esther 2:17. This moment didn't just change Esther's life forever. It marked the beginning of a divine mission with eternal consequences. To celebrate his new queen, the king held a feast in Esther's honor. As a public show of favor, he offered tax relief to the provinces and gave generous gifts to the people. While Esther's elevation to the throne was met with celebration, something critical and unnoticed was unfolding behind the scenes. Mordecai remained vigilant, watching from the palace gates. One day, he uncovered a plot. Two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, were conspiring to assassinate Xerxes. Mordecai acted swiftly, informing Esther, who then warned the king in her cousin's name. The plot was investigated, confirmed, and the traitors were executed. Although this act of loyalty was recorded in the royal chronicles, Mordecai received no reward at the time. Yet this detail would later play a pivotal role in the story's unfolding justice. It is at this point that Haman enters the scene, a man of Agagite descent who rises to immense power, second only to the king himself. With this newfound authority, Haman demands that all bow before him in reverence. But Mordecai, faithful to the commandments of his God, refuses to kneel, as he bows only to the Lord. This defiance enrages Haman. His anger turns into hatred, and he seeks revenge not just on Mordecai, but on the entire Jewish people. Haman persuades the king that the Jews are a dangerous, scattered people with their own laws, unfaithful to the empire, and proposes their complete extermination. In exchange for the king's permission, he offers an enormous sum of silver for the royal treasury. The king, unaware of Haman's true motives, gives him his signet ring, granting full authority to draft and seal a royal decree. Thus, a death sentence is issued throughout the empire. On a single day, all Jews, men, women, and children, were to be destroyed. The date chosen was the 13th day of the month of Adar. The news spread quickly, plunging the Jewish population into shock and despair. Scripture captures the anguish with precision. Letters were sent to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews in one day. Esther 3:13. Across every province and city, the people wept, fasted, and dressed in sackcloth. Mordecai, overwhelmed with grief, tore his clothes, covered himself in ashes, and stood at the palace gate crying out for help. But his cries were more than sorrow. They were a direct call to Esther, urging her, now queen, to plead for her people before the king, even if it meant risking her own life. Upon receiving Mordecai's message, Esther found herself facing one of the most difficult decisions of her life. To approach the king without being summoned was a grave offense, punishable by death, unless he extended the golden scepter as a sign of mercy. Still, remaining silent in the face of the threat looming over her, people could result in irreversible tragedy. After much prayer and reflection, Esther displayed unshakable faith by taking an action that would go down in history as one of the boldest ever recorded in Scripture. She asked Mordecai to gather all the Jews of Susa to fast for 3 days and 3 nights, crying out to God for mercy. Only after that would she present herself before the king, even if it meant facing death. Her words were filled with determination and courage. "I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." With this decision, Esther not only risked her life, but fully embraced her role as a divine instrument of salvation. During those days of fasting and prayer, while the nation cried out in unison for deliverance, Esther prepared herself to face her destiny. Her trust in God strengthened her with every passing moment. Mordecai, meanwhile, kept hope alive among the Jews, reminding them of God's power and encouraging unwavering faith in divine deliverance. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal garments, a symbol of her newly assumed authority, and stepped into the inner court of the palace. The atmosphere was tense. The guards watched in silence, and the king, upon seeing Esther, remained still. Then, in a gesture that would change the course of history, Xerxes extended his golden scepter toward the queen. Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, securing her life. It was a sign that God was at work. The door to salvation had been opened. Esther had found favor in the king's eyes, and that simple act represented not only her acceptance, but renewed hope for her entire people. Having won the king's favor, Esther began a carefully crafted plan. Rather than revealing her request right away, she invited Xerxes and Haman to a special banquet. The unexpected invitation stirred the king's interest and fed Haman's vanity. During the dinner, Xerxes asked Esther what she desired, promising to grant even the impossible. With tact and discernment, Esther responded with another invitation to a second banquet the following day. She was creating the perfect setting for her revelation, guiding events with prudence and wisdom. Meanwhile, Haman, drunk with pride, left the feast pleased with himself. But as he passed through the palace gates, he again encountered Mordecai, who, faithful to his God, refused to bow. Furious, Haman ordered the construction of a gallows more than 75 feet high to publicly execute Mordecai, anticipating his final victory over the Jews. That very night, King Xerxes was struck by an unshakable restlessness that kept him awake. Without knowing why, he ordered the royal chronicles to be read aloud. During the reading, he was reminded of Mordecai's heroic act in exposing the plot against his life. Realizing that no reward had ever been given, the king decided to honor him immediately. The next day, upon seeing Haman, Xerxes asked how to properly reward a man the king wished to honor. Assuming the honor was for himself, Haman suggested a grand celebration: royal robes, the king's horse, and public praise. To his shock and humiliation, the king ordered Haman to do exactly that for Mordecai. Haman was forced to lead his enemy through the city streets, proclaiming his greatness. It was a devastating blow to Haman's ego, and the first visible sign that his schemes were unraveling. Still shaken, Haman barely had time to recover before being summoned to Esther's second banquet. During the feast, the king again asked, "What is your request, my queen?" Esther, with firmness and emotion, replied, "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, grant me my life and the life of my people." It was a bombshell revelation. Esther disclosed her Jewish identity and exposed the deadly trap Haman had set to annihilate her entire people. The king, shocked and enraged, demanded to know who was responsible for such evil. Esther pointed directly at Haman. In a fit of rage, Xerxes stormed out to the palace garden. Meanwhile, Haman, desperate, fell at the queen's feet to beg for mercy. When the king returned, he interpreted the scene as an assault against Esther. Without hesitation, he ordered Haman's arrest and execution on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Haman's fate was sealed. The man who had plotted to destroy an entire people was undone by his own wicked plans. Yet despite Haman's fall, the danger had not passed. The decree ordering the extermination of the Jews was still in effect. According to Persian law, a royal edict sealed with the king's ring could not be revoked. Facing this grim reality, Esther, with humility and urgency, once again approached the king. This time pleading not only for mercy, but for a concrete solution to save her nation. Once again, she touched the golden scepter and was heard. Xerxes authorized her and Mordecai to draft a new decree. Mordecai was appointed to Haman's former position and received the royal signet ring. A new official document was issued, granting the Jews the right to defend themselves on the day marked for their destruction, with full royal authority to resist any attack. The new order was swiftly dispatched across the empire, restoring hope among the Jewish communities. In place of fear and mourning came celebration and joy. The Bible describes the moment vividly. In every province and in every city, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebration. Esther 8:17. The transformation was dramatic. The people once doomed to die were now honored and respected. Many, witnessing the power of God over the Jews, began to sympathize with them, recognizing that their faith was alive and their God real. And so the dreaded 13th day of the month of Adar arrived. But this time, the Jews were ready. Organized and united, they fought with courage to protect their lives. The strength of their faith and spiritual resolve became their greatest weapons. Their enemies, once bold and confident, now feared them. Mordecai, elevated to a position of great authority, was admired by leaders and feared by adversaries. In Susa, the battle was intense. On the first day, the Jews defeated 500 opponents, including Haman's 10 sons. Though victorious, threats remained. Esther, ever persistent, requested that the king allow one more day of defense in Susa, and her request was granted. On the second day, 300 more enemies were defeated, and the bodies of Haman's sons were hanged as a sign of justice. This victory was not only military, but spiritual. It was confirmation that God had heard the cry of his people. Mordecai, now adorned in royal garments, draped in purple and crowned, symbolized the restoration of justice and honor for the Jews. The people who had stood at the edge of annihilation were now celebrating a living miracle. Though God's name is not explicitly mentioned in the book of Esther, his presence is undeniable in every twist, every deliverance, and every divine orchestration. Esther's story has since become an eternal reminder that divine providence never fails, even in the darkest of times. The resounding victory achieved by the Jews was not merely a momentary deliverance, but the beginning of a celebration that would echo through the centuries, the festival of Purim. Mordecai established this feast so that year after year, on the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, the descendants of those who had been saved would remember the deliverance granted by God. The name Purim comes from the word pur, meaning lot, referring to the method Haman used to determine the day of the massacre. What was once planned as a day of death became a lasting memorial of life and divine intervention. Scripture is emphatic. These days of Purim should never cease to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should their memory fade among their descendants. Esther 9:28. Marked by joy, generosity, food sharing, and aid to the needy, this celebration became a symbol that evil can be defeated and that God acts even in the most unlikely circumstances. To this day, Purim is observed not just as a religious tradition, but as a living testimony of God's faithfulness and the courage of one woman who rose to change the destiny of her nation. The biblical account concludes with Mordecai elevated to the most prestigious position in the kingdom, second only to the king himself. His leadership became a model of justice, wisdom, and commitment to peace and the welfare of the Jewish people. Esther, in turn, remains forever etched in the spiritual memory of her people as a radiant example of courage, loyalty, and intercession. Even though God's name is never mentioned directly in the book, his presence is felt in every scene, every twist, every providential detail. God moves behind the scenes of history, even when unspoken. He guides kings, alters decrees, and raises ordinary people for extraordinary purposes. The story of Esther is a vibrant narrative of how heaven intervenes in human affairs through available vessels, even when everything seems silent. Esther was not just a courageous figure. She was the embodiment of active faith, of hope that refuses to be silenced, and of obedience that does not retreat. Her journey inspires all who face dark times, showing that the favor of God can find us even when everything seems lost. She never had a heavenly vision or heard an audible voice, but she responded in faith to the signs, to the challenges, and to the cries of her people. Her famous words, "If I perish, do not express defeat, but total surrender to a higher purpose. Across the centuries, her story remains one of the greatest lessons that God raises the unlikely, empowers the humble, and manifests his glory through the quiet courage of those who trust in his power. For those living today in environments hostile to faith, Esther is a clear model of spiritual resistance. She never denied who she was, even when it meant taking great risks. In a society that tried to reshape her by its values, Esther held firm to her identity as a servant of the Most High God. In times when convictions are watered down and principles easily compromised, her life teaches us to remain steadfast, even if it costs us comfort or social acceptance. God's silence in the book of Esther is not absence, but sovereignty. Every coincidence in the story is actually divine providence. Every finely placed detail proves that God doesn't need to be visible to be real. He operates with precision, even when he is not perceived, for his hand governs even the invisible. Another pillar of this story is the power of intercession. Esther did not act impulsively or alone. She sought God through fasting and called an entire community to pray with her. Her action was preceded by deep spiritual surrender. The faith she demonstrated was not passive, but active, attentive to divine guidance. How often do we face crises and fail to pray, to intercede, to trust that God can intervene? Esther challenges us to become intercessors for our generation, to cry out for our families, our cities, our nations. When we bend our knees, we touch heaven and trigger change on earth. The greatest battles are always first fought in the spiritual realm. It is in the silence of prayer and the power of fasting that God prepares us for transformative action. Purim, therefore, is more than a date on the calendar. It is a living memory that God turns death sentences into celebrations of life. Every remembrance of the feast points to the triumph of good over evil, of faith over fear, and of providence over chance. The story of Esther and Mordecai is not merely a page of the past, but a legacy that calls us to live with purpose, courage, and faith. It proves that the decisions we make today can echo in eternity. Even small acts of faithfulness can result in great deliverance. When we make ourselves available to God, our actions can reach generations and impact destinies we could never imagine. And finally, there is a powerful connection between Esther and the greatest example of intercession in all of human history, Jesus Christ. Just as Esther stood before a king at the risk of her life, Jesus entered the heavenly throne room, fully aware that the cross would be the price of our redemption. But unlike Esther, whose life was spared, Christ gave his life completely to secure our salvation. The cross was his ultimate act of intercession. He took upon himself the decree of condemnation that weighed over us, and through his resurrection, he cancelled every accusation. If Esther saved her people from a massacre, Jesus saved us from an eternity without God. While the Jews celebrate Purim, remembering the deliverance in Susa, Christians celebrate Easter, the definitive victory of the cross over sin, death, and hell. If you've made it this far, following this story filled with faith, courage, and redemption, know that none of this was by chance. May Esther's life renew your hope, strengthen your faith, and remind you that God still writes incredible stories through ordinary people. Even in times of silence, he is at work. And if this narrative touched your heart, I invite you to continue this journey of discovery. Watch the next video, where we explore another powerful moment in Scripture, the dramatic encounter between Joshua and the angel of the Lord. Click the screen now and dive into another divine revelation. Thank you for being with us. May God bless your life abundantly, today and always.